Welcome to the bi-weekly cluster API provider for vSphere meeting. This is a Kubernetes SIG meeting, and as such will be uploaded to YouTube as a public video. So if you do not wish yourself to be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, please go ahead and log out now. And please respect others and just basically don't be rude. And those are the rules. Should be pretty easy. The same rules we learned in kindergarten. All right, so today, let me share my screen. I was grooming the backlog or getting ready for it. Let's see it. All righty, move this. Okay, so today's meeting, first item is if you're attending, could you add yourself to the list there? Should only be 2 other people. In fact, I'll just add you too. There. The first item is that we released v04.0 last Friday, July 26th. So congrats to everybody who had a hand in that. When these meetings are smaller, this is sort of a seg or sort of a off remark. It always feels weird to speak in the broad sense. I know everyone on the call, but let's pretend I didn't just say that. So yay, everyone give themselves a hand. And I want to especially call out thanks to Travis. So I'm glad he's on the call for his work on the release script. And I didn't link the jobs, but all the jobs that he added to Prout. Basically, all that was involved in this release was pushing the tag, and his jobs and script handled everything else. So special thanks to Travis there. Before we get to the backlog grooming, I wanted to call attention to this issue, or PR rather, 448, something I put forward. I'm not saying that it needs to be part of the next release, but I would like some feedback on it before I open it up to potentially, be part of a release, whether or not it's necessary or a good idea. I think with this, it's basically a command that would be used to generate the manifests that are used with CapV. And I want to be very clear on something. I've discussed this sort of at length with Andrew. And I guess we both kind of want to be clear on something. Despite what our opinions may be on whether or not we should be generating manifests, since other Kubernetes projects tend to just document what those are and allow their users to write them on their own, there is the CAPI community and the CAPI parent project decided that due to the complexity of this project, there is going to be manifest generation. So this issue, this PR rather, isn't a place to debate whether or not we should be generating manifests. That is a perfectly valid discussion to have, and I encourage people to have it, and it should be held in the actual CAPI community. This is just about taking a process that we are asked to do and try to make it simpler. So at that out of the way, the primary impetus for this command is that it generates manifests from the types that are built into the command. So when you build the manifest command, it's being built with the same types that the cluster cuddle command is, that the manager binary is. So it's generating YAML from those version types. So it lessens the chance of there being an opportunity to have a YAML manifest generated from at a different version than the manager you're using. This would still use the same the manifest image that we created. It would just replace the generate YAML script inside of it. And again, it just sort of removes chances for errors. And in writing this, I also made it possible for other providers to adopt this. I'm not going to get into how that happens. I will say there is one really interesting thing about it that I encourage people to look at. I linked customize as a library as opposed as a command, and I created a concept that I called virtual patches, which I shared with some people across the community. So it's the ability to apply customized patches to your customization that actually don't exist as anything but yet templates that get interpolated. So maybe interesting for people to look at. Another thing for people to take a look at is the new troubleshooting guide. This was added in time for our last release. Many thanks to Jim Weber, who's not on the call, and Andrew Sykem and Travis for assisting with this. I literally wrote this the day of the release, but we and so we were validating it and reviewing it. We get a lot of questions about CAPV that and issues filed that basically boil down to something's broken and there's no more information than that. So this is supposed to cover how to access logs, how to enable logging and then how to access those logs, as well as review some of the common issues people using CAPV encounter and how to resolve those issues. So if there's anything that you would like to add to this, please feel free to open a PR. Okay, so last 2 weeks ago, I mentioned in Slack that I asked whether or not I'm sorry, I have to, I don't know if it's a yawn. I keep trying to swallow it. I asked in Slack whether it was time to consider the migration to CAPI v1 Alpha 2. And a few days later, there had not been any responses. So I time boxed it to last Friday and the time ran out. And so we are officially going to start moving master to CAPI v1 Alpha 2. But that doesn't mean tomorrow we're going to be v1 Alpha 2. It means we need to figure out what that means. So I created this issue that we can use to track the work necessary. So I know there are some machine image changes, and I know there's an outstanding issue with Cloud Init for CentOS 7. I'm going to be updating this with some additional details. Due to some other things on which I was working, I didn't have time to fill this out as much as I would like ahead of this meeting. But we want to identify the work necessary to move us to v1 Alpha 2 and use that as use this issue 472 as a tracking issue. Unfortunately, it looks like Siddharth and Hui could not make it. So there are 2 outstanding PRs that I know we, at least one that looks like we might need, and one that I don't know if we actually need the bits from, but we need the intent. So I was going to ask if they could rebase those. But one is this 271, which I keep forgetting is out there, but couldn't potentially be related to something. Oh, no, this is Siddharth. Yeah, I said Siddharth and Hui. Yeah. So basically, if the node object, it has to do with deletes. And we all know that deleting objects in CAPV or the delete logic can sometimes be a little flaky. And so this made things less flaky, but it was based on pre-v030. So I was going to ask Siddharth if he thinks this is still an issue, and if it is, if you could rebase it. Hey, Siddharth, you showed up. Great. Can you let me know if this should still be an issue? If it is, can you rebase it?
I think I need to double check, but if I remember correctly, I saw some code in the CAPI code where the deletion of node was happening. Let me double check that, because if that is happening in the latest code of CAPI, then we don't necessarily need to do this.
Great.
Our side.
Great. Now, yeah, I was trying to triage the older PRs.
Okay. No worries.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll let you update that and close it if it's no longer needed.
Sure, we'll do that.
By the way, there was a change in CAPI 1.8 that we just merged support for into master that has to do with node ref deletion as well. So you may want to check that as well. It may be part of 1.8. I will check with Hui offline about testing different specs. Travis, this goes to what you and I were discussing, not entirely, which was I would like to test against different images. This is where Hui was actually producing different E2E spec variations. Instead of just the ones in Bootstrap spec, he had a bunch of them listed, and then he had, there's a tremendous amount of file changes. So I think he was having to deal with the different outcome. It's 26 files changed for different specs that didn't exactly seem correct. I also think it had to do with the installer OVA, but someone was going to have him look at that. And then I was going, go ahead.
I was going to say that makes sense, and I'll take a look at it as well to see how it could also line up with testing different operating systems.
Okay. Somebody, Yukharov, for those watching the video, is an intern on our team at VMware. A very bright individual, volunteered to take this issue that I slotted into 041 for generating E2E specs at runtime. He's actually done quite a bit of work on it, so it may be something relevant or related that could help this as well. Because we want to be able to dog food our manifest generation as opposed to just relying on that bootstrap spec directory. And finally, before we get to the actual backlog grooming, I was going to check with Hui on the status of 306. For those unfamiliar, this is the ability to build machine images using different package sources. Hui and I had a Zoom chat about this. He actually is aware of exactly what to do. I was just trying to get him to add that to the issue because we didn't write that down as we just took us about an hour, but we didn't write it down as we were discussing it. So I know he's not blocked on this. I just wanted to get a status update and just have him kind of review the next steps. But the high level overview is this will give people the ability to build machine images for CapV using different package sources instead of just the official like Ubuntu package sources. So if Red Hat wanted to build CapV images, they could use their repo. You know, Google, they could use their repo. VMware could use theirs, but the process is the same. The result's the same, just different provenance. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and one more thing before we go into the backlog updates. Let me do a machine images. This is sort of exciting news. The CapV image stamping tool has been imported into the upstream Kubernetes image builder repo as the CAPI image stamping tool. And last week I had a meeting with two Kappa members, Chuck Ha and Jason Dieter, and I am on the hook to open a PR against the CAPI image stamping tool to reintroduce support for Kappa. It technically does support Kappa, but the provider.json is different. But yeah, so the actual upstream image builder is based on the CapV image builder, which I think is kind of exciting. I always put Kubernetes. Okay, so finally backlog grooming. This is just what I've identified. It is not an exhaustive list. So let's just kind of go through this, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time left to review other things that people want to discuss. So, it was just only one is merged for 041. CAPI 018. Let's see what that entails. I think I linked it. Yes. So, Siddharth, this is the issue. I don't know if it's the same thing, but it has to do with before removing the finalizers. So I don't know. Just so you're aware, if you find 458 for CapV, it links to that release.
Perfect. I'll take a look. Thank you.
So this was actually opened earlier today. It's passed testing twice, but things keep getting merged, so it has to redo the tests. I put it first because it might generate the most discussion, but it's also important. So this changes the way we configure CapV at a fairly basic level. It centralizes cloud provider configuration. And let me find one of the files to give you an example of what it does. Let me actually find the README. Oh no, getting started. So from now on, the cluster spec will define this new type called cloud provider configuration. And then if the keys look familiar, they should. They're directly out of the in-tree and out-of-tree INI spec. But the new objects can be marshaled and unmarshaled from JSON using Kubernetes compatible key names. So just like you might define your cluster configuration for kubeadm, you also define your cloud provider configuration. You define your secret namespace. The virtual center is a map of values, much like it would be for the INI file. you had to define your network, and then you define your workspace. By the way, there is an error here. It's fixed in the actual code. Either there needs to be a global data centers element, or data centers needs to be listed under the virtual center. That actually is fixed in the code. I just need to update the getting started, just so you're aware. One thing is missing though. You no longer see data store, resource pool, or folder as part of the machine specs. I had a long chat with Andrew Sykem about this, and in fact, I linked to the, darn it, I linked to the conversation in the, down here, where Andrew had opened an issue on aligning CAPV with the vSphere cloud provider. So if you want to read more about this issue, you can go to the PR and then click on the link in the description to this conversation. But essentially, a few topics came up. One, it doesn't make sense, or let's kind of start over. Without a cloud provider at all, it makes sense that a machine, multiple machines that you deploy for a Kubernetes cluster could have different, what I call location specs. And in fact, that's what they call it in the vSphere SDK. And a location spec is information that includes, but not limited to, things like the data store, the resource pool, the folder, perhaps even the data center. However, after we start making some assumptions, the need for those at the machine level is obviated. What assumptions? Well, or really almost even a declaration. I'm going to declare today, and feel free to disagree, but we will have to figure out a way around it, that CAPV is no longer designed to deploy Kubernetes clusters that don't have either the in-tree or out-of-tree vSphere cloud provider running. That's not just a choice that CAPV makes, but rather because CAPV relies on CAPI and the node-ref controller to identify when a machine is ready by virtue of matching it to a node in the Kubernetes cluster via the provider ID, the cloud provider has to be running to set that node's provider ID, or else that match never gets made and the cluster never comes up. So as it's designed today, by making use of CAPI functionality, not CAPV, but CAPI functionality and CAPI assumptions, CAPV is not designed to deploy Kubernetes clusters that don't have one of the two vSphere cloud providers running on them. Because of that, because both vSphere cloud providers do not support machines in a cluster that have differing location specs, except for data center because of DRS scenarios, the location spec in both the in-tree and out-of-tree cloud provider allows you to specify different data centers, but the folder, data store, and resource pool are all defined at the workspace level. And you can have VMs in a single Kubernetes cluster spanning data centers, but those data centers have to have data stores, resource pools, and folders in sync with one another based on the name for the cloud provider to find VMs in those locations across the multiple data centers. So since we can no longer deploy a cluster without the vSphere cloud provider enabled, and because the vSphere cloud provider doesn't support deploying machines to different locations other than the data center, it no longer made sense to include the data store, resource pool, and folder on a per machine level. So that has been removed. So when you define the location that you want machines, it's now part of the cloud provider configuration under workspace. You may still define the data center in which you want a machine. And if you do that, you need to make sure that it's added to the cloud provider configuration up here, because the cloud provider is only going to look in the data centers that it defines.
Has this been added into the docs yet, Andrew?
These are the getting started page for the PR. This is updated part of the PR. But everything I just said, no, it's more in this comment. So yeah, you're right. Like that whole explanation about why those values are no longer part of the machine, I think I was chalking up to, hey, it's alpha, but it's probably worth having, a note here that these values are configured at the cluster level because, and point to the cloud provider.
Yeah, maybe nag me. I'm not necessarily 100% committing to doing the docs,
Sure.
but I might be willing to, or find somebody else to do it. But based on what I've seen in Slack, users are going to do the wrong thing and then be out there. So
a change that was made in the last release, Steve, on the getting started, users now generate manifests using the manifest image, which is always tied to a manager image that matches the manifest image. So if they generate a manifest image, it's going to be compatible with the manager they choose.
uh-huh.
So it should, where they get into trouble is if they were to use older specs that they previously generated.
Yeah, maybe they update or something. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and then they get into trouble. But Siddharth, I'm kind of you filed the original issue wanting this, so I hopefully you don't have any objections. But I am eagerly awaiting your feedback because you worked on this a lot too.
Yes, I mean, so actually, I'm very glad that you made this particular change specifically for the cloud provider configuration section. I think that's like perfect. However, I do have some concern about if you were to take out all those settings, like location-specific settings in the machines spec, and so maybe, for example, as a sample resource pool, for example, you could deploy your machines in two different resource pools, but from the vSphere cloud provider perspective, does it need to know both the resource pools, for example? I mean, what would happen? I'm trying to understand.
That's a good question. We raised that in the aligning cat view with vSphere cloud provider. The vSphere, but based on the configs, they only support defining the resource pool in a single location. The data center is the only value that is allowed with multiple values. Every other location-specific value is singular.
Okay, so does that mean that when the cloud provider, for example, when the cloud provider comes up, then because cloud provider is reading this particular configuration, so for it to discover what VM a particular node is, does it look under the purview of only the scoped view of this workspace? Is that what it is? Like, for example, when it needs to detect what is the provider ID of, let's say, a VM, one of the machine nodes, then would it actually go and try and search that VM based on the parameters that are part of this particular config itself?
So the cloud provider doesn't do the provider ID through the SDK. It does that through an ID that Kubernetes gives it. It's ultimately the same BIOS UUID. It gets converted from little endian to big endian or vice versa. I always forget which. What it does affect is the lookup of the VM in the inventory based on the VM name. The name must be unique across the data, or at least at the resource pool level. I'd have to double check. I did encounter this issue originally because you have to remember the only thing that, or in another issue I encountered this, the only thing that's unique about a VM as far as Kubernetes knows is the name. And so that's why even across data centers, the VM names have to be unique. Kubernetes doesn't know where this node is coming from. And so it gets the name, it asks VM, the cloud provider, what is the name of this thing? So I do believe it's drilling down into the inventory to find that, but I don't know the exact location parameters that it's using. I was mainly, I'll admit freely, I was working backwards off of the config spec. So maybe it does ignore resource pool. I could double check that, but basically whatever it does respect and look at, we can't define at the machine level. And I'll give you an example. Before we were just looking at the first machine and getting these values, you could easily, in that situation, have created machine specs for subsequent machines that the cloud provider wouldn't have been able to resolve if you had placed them in different locations that the cloud provider didn't see. So yeah, I'll need to double check that. But you're right. Maybe some of these can make their way back out to the machine spec. I have to go look at the cloud provider code to be certain, though.
Yeah, actually, as you were talking, I was just basically just going at least into the entry version just to take a look at what it's doing. But yeah, my point is, I think,
I get it.
I think we might want to just scope it to whatever the minimum that has to come from the specific setting from the cloud provider side, that we can leave it only in one place. I completely agree that if there is an information that has to be driven from the cloud provider configuration, then let's keep it only in here and not replicate that in machine spec whatsoever.
But if something can be in multiple, we should leave it. I
Yes.
totally. I will revisit that before we
Okay.
merge this. The couple of more things about this particular change. So I define these types in CapV. These are new types to CapV. They're under the V1 alpha folder as a new package called Cloud. I even say, hey, here are the reasons I put them there. There were some incorrect tags in the cloud provider types in the external cloud provider. Yeah, so that's where I was working from, Andrew. There were some. Thank you for the link. There were some incorrect tags, and as well as the types in the external cloud provider don't have any JSON tags, and the deep copy generation tool from the Kubernetes community doesn't support nested anonymous structs. So we had to get rid of those. And finally, we needed a way to marshal the object back to INI. Because the moment that we define this as part of the the cluster provider spec, it has to be defined in YAML. And if you want to define it in a sane way, I mean, you could inline the INI, but that would look weird. And I don't think anyone wants that. This is also in line with the component config work streams of which Andrew is a part. So this sort of supports maybe a future pivot towards component config for the cloud provider. So the long-term solution, though, it doesn't make sense for these types, in my opinion, or any of this new functionality to live in CapV. So long-term, I would like to move these types or make changes to the existing types in the external cloud provider and have CapV just pull that in, just like it pulls in the kubeadm cluster config. I'd like it to pull in the vSphere cloud provider cloud config as just a field in the CapV cluster spec. Additionally, two more things. There is no existing package to marshal Ghost structures to INI. The GCFG package doesn't support marshaling at all. I found a new package called Go INI that looked very promising, but it doesn't support marshaling a specific type. I opened an issue for that, asking the author to please support this. In the meantime, I just wrote my own marshaller. It uses reflection. It works very well for our needs. And long term, I would like to move this stuff back into CapV. Sorry, the cloud provider, all the functionality, all the type changes. And finally, I ask whether or not we need to support INI. I know it's mainly for backwards compatibility, but because of component config, because we want to inline the cloud provider config with the CapV cluster spec, because all of that requires YAML JSON specs. Because the only reason we do INI is for backwards compatibility anyway, at some point, can we not declare at a certain version that we sunset INI and then we support moving forward only the new JSON YAML version of the cloud provider config, and even taking it a step further, introducing the JSON YAML support sooner and just checking both. First, check to see if it's INI. If it isn't, check to see if it's JSON YAML, or in reverse. I don't really care. Because a lot of the work I did on this PR was just to handle all the INI weirdness, which is just kind of unique to this situation and totally unnecessary if we just sunset INI support. We're not going to come up with a decision here. It's not even CapV's decision to make. I just wanted to call attention to that.
I think I like the idea, actually, specifically the pushing these types to the cloud provider. That actually makes a lot of sense. As you said, similar to how kubeadm configuration exists, that will be actually much neater.
Yeah, and I need to make a note on that comment that I don't think the config types are currently versioned as API objects in the cloud provider. And so that would be useful too. It would support component config, and then they would get all the fun features of being API objects. So anyway, that was the first issue, and I put that for 041. 041 does not have a date, mainly because, for those who don't know, I am going on PTO starting tomorrow for at least through this week and the first couple of days of next. And so, not that this project can't exist without me, it absolutely did before and can while I'm gone and will when I'm no longer on the project. But because right now I'm the only active coder, Andrew Sycam, you did a little work over Friday, but it's like I'm 95% primarily the main coder in the last release. I don't know what it's going to do to resourcing or these PRs or outstanding issues, how much work's going to get done while I'm gone. And probably a ton in design, probably more than I'm gone in design because I won't be here cluttering things up. But the actual code, I don't think we're resourced to do it right now. So I didn't want to put a date on this yet. But yeah, I prioritize this because it's a big change and I want to get that tested as early as possible. So this next one, I'll let Andrew sort of review.
Yeah, sure. So on Friday, we found a bug where if you specify multiple network devices and even one of those network devices don't return a valid IP, so either you disabled DHCP, but then you forgot to add a static IP, or you specified the wrong static IP or whatever, then the entire machine actuator kind of errors on a machine. And because it can't fetch like a valid IP from any of the network devices, or sorry, because it errors, if it errors on one, it returns early. And so the entire kind of cluster creation process fails because we can't get a valid control plane endpoint for the cluster. And so I opened a PR where essentially if you're going to find at least one valid IP address on any network device, then we use that as, we kind of let the machine go through even with that one IP address. And so that should fix a lot of issues we've been seeing with users running into issues when they try to specify multiple network addresses on their machines.
Yeah, specifically, it requeues. Currently, it says all network devices must have at least one IP, or requeue until they do. And so Andrew changed it. So as soon as one network device has an IP, it will go forward. Now, we are well aware of the case that might not be the IP you want. And Andrew has code that checks to see if it is, and if it's not, it requeues so that it will continue to wait until the other thing is available. But this at least this lets the process happen a little sooner and supposed to requeue until they all do, since, like Andrew explained, there are occasions where a device is never going to have an IP.
So just so that I understand, I mean, so this is in the machine spec, I specified multiple networks. So the controller comes in, it actually clones that VM, powers it on, and now we're waiting for the IPs to show up basically in the VMware tools report those IPs, right? Is that correct? Is that the right stage where we are kind of trying to assess the situation?
Yeah. And Andrew's change has it so that if any of those devices has an IP, to let the boot process proceed and don't requeue with waiting on IPs. Before, it was going to continue to requeue until all devices had an IP address. But there are valid use cases where the network on one device gets configured post-boot.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if you specify, like, if multiple network devices are going to have addresses, then we're going to always use the first network device that returns an address for the control plane endpoint. But that was always kind of a problem, and we knew that, which is why we added the preferred API server CIDR field earlier to allow us to specify. So like if the first address that comes up is not in that CIDR, then we would just requeue anyways until an address in that CIDR comes up. Mm-hmm. So in the end, it's all the same. It's just we're preventing this state of constant, like, infinite requeues where if one of the addresses that wasn't valid never came up.
So, okay, so maybe another way to say it is if you have, let's say, and as an example, you had 3 NICs and you specified the preferred API network CIDR, and till the time you basically we are waiting till the time any of the 3 NICs, for example, if they show up with an IP that is matching that preferred CIDR, then we basically go ahead and say, let's move on and go to the next phase, as opposed to waiting for all the 3 to get the IP. Did I get
No, no, it's you can probably easier to read the code. We thought about doing it that way, but we kept the logic divorced. The first check is, does any NIC have an IP? At the point that any NIC has an IP, the process goes forward. Later on, when we say get the IP for the VM, if the only IP address that comes back is outside that preferred CIDR, it will requeue then, because it says you have an IP, but it's not in the preferred CIDR, so it's not the one that I can use. It requeues there. But that check is later. The first check is just, does anything have a preferred CIDR? Or sorry, does any NIC have an IP? And it's because that first check happens at a place that we don't know about the preferred CIDR, and we don't want to make that decision there. Because there are occasions where you might want a VM to come up with an IP address outside the Kubernetes range.
Yeah, but to answer your question, like, in that scenario where you have 3 NICs and at least one of them does come up with the preferred CIDR, then later in the path, the actuator, it would allow it to finish booting.
Yes.
Right. So at the end of the day, I mean, for the state of that machine to go from just a VM before being cloned to a point where it becomes a node, for that entire thing to happen, we do wait on having at least one of the NICs come up with that preferred CIDR address.
We have to. You have to.
Okay.
You can't contact it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you don't specify the CIDR, then it just picks the first one that comes up.
Yeah, I mean, then there is not much of an option there. So,
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Just so you know, in this particular case, it was where the second network was coming up later, and that was but it doesn't come up until after boot, and so we just kept requeuing because it wasn't getting configured, since we didn't let it get that far. Anyway, but you can read the code. I think it's pretty straightforward. Andrew did a really good job on it. So there is another issue, using generated instead of committed specs for the E2E pre-submit. That has been resourced by Yukharov. I kind of explain here what's going on. Currently, the E2E job uses specs out of this directory, and we would like to use the manifest image to generate these specs as opposed to using the pre-generated ones to help dog food the manifest generation process. It is resourced. I know Yukharov is working on it.
Yeah, one note there, Andrew. I did sync up with Yuvraj on Friday because you had asked him to sync up with me, and so I showed him kind of the new path to all the images that are built and all of that. So he should be well on his way there.
Great. I know he's been busy because of the poster session, so he was doing great work there. All right, so I created this issue, I guess, a while back. I thought it was more recent than that. But this shouldn't be a lot of work, but I'm hopefully somebody can resource this. If not, I can probably take care of it. But mark a machine in error if a VM cannot be cloned because the name already exists. So I've seen occasions where people forget to clean up their old environment and they go to create a new cluster and they get clone failed, but it's just because a VM with the same name already exists. That should be a very easy check we can do, and it falls under the next issue. This has been resourced by Thomas Kraus. He was here last week, but I don't think he's on this week. Basically, I wrote this. I've been writing issues that I consider good first issues and sort of advertising them for people interested in getting started with CapV. We see a lot of problems with people using CapV where the config is just wrong. And the problem with a bad config or a VM with the same name is that the way CapV fails is pretty opaque. It's not easy to figure out at all because cluster cuddle just hangs and you have to know where to go get the logs. That's the whole point of the troubleshooting guide. But there's an opportunity to at least simplify some of that. And I outlined it here that we would like a package for validating the API spec, either first as a package and then potentially as something we add to cluster cuddle, but something we could at least be reusable. And you could go read this issue for more information. It should be version specific for the package. It should do things like validate the vSphere credentials, validate access to the inventory, validate that a VM with these names do not exist yet. Things that we can do ahead of actually doing the bootstrap to validate that it should work and not just fail in an opaque way. So that's been resourced. Finally, on the list of ones that well, there's one more that's not here because it's not one of our issues, but I'm going to bring it up because it changes CAPV in another fundamental way. So setting control plane endpoint results in invalid endpoint value. This is one I've noticed, and it took me 2 hours last week to reproduce because I had to start from scratch because I didn't record any of the logs the last time. I think I went over this with Yuvraj. I thought it was Siddharth, but it was Yuvraj. Basically, if you specify an external control plane endpoint, you get this weird error saying target cluster is not, okay, this is the one you're all used to, but it says host must be a host port pair, and it's only this value. The thing is that it should never just be that value, because I've traced the code and so have 2 other people, and they both agree that it should be a valid value at that point. We just need to add some logging and figure out what we're all missing. And it should be pretty straightforward to fix, but right now it's preventing the use of an external load balancer for HA testing. So it's fairly high priority in my mind. Facts. I don't know how to do the priority stuff. I've not done it, but where is it? Priority. Important soon. Probably supposed to use the tide things. And this one, again, is just, I know where it is. I just haven't had time to fix it. Basically, if you've got control plane endpoint defined, it doesn't add a port the way it would do if it pulls the IP address from a machine. Right now, CAPV, if it pulls the control plane endpoint from a machine's IP address, it always adds a port either based on the default port or one that's been specified. But if you've got an external control plane address defined, it doesn't add the port to that. So that's why that's failed. And either somebody else or I can take care of those, but they are important for HA testing, which is why I'm marking them as important. There was one more issue that is important. It's not one of ours. Let me find it real quick because it's related to us. It was an issue filed this morning based on a conversation I had with Andy Goldstein. So today, where was it? It was in, I think Andy filed it in Cluster API. Sorry for this. Okay, yeah, here we go. So we had an issue last release where somebody mentioned that the VMs didn't heal automatically. And what they meant by that was when a VM was deleted out from underneath CAPV, the expectation would be that it should be recreated. And I totally agreed with that. I said that absolutely makes sense to me. Recreate a VM if it's been deleted. The machine says there should be a VM, so recreate it. This morning, Andy Goldstein came to me because there was a person at VMware who had a problem that we realized was caused by this. Siddharth, I actually think it may have come from a team member, one of your colleagues.
I'm actually looking at that bug right now.
Yeah. So but it's internal. So, but the actual bug is interesting because what happens is we recreate the VM with the same name, except that because it's the same name, it doesn't. The node just kind of tries to get added back into the control plane or the cluster, except it doesn't actually re-add it because it says it's already there. It hasn't been ejected yet, but it has a different provider ID. So CAPV never matches it up, and it just causes a problem. And so turns out the intent was, and I asked Andy for the documentation so that I could reference it. He said, well, I think he said that it was a discussion that he, Tim St. Clair, and Jason had all had, but he couldn't actually find the documentation for it. And I said, well, we kind of need to reference that because, in my opinion, by the way, what they said that the Kappa does and what they expect it to do is to mark the machine in error. I said, I see that, but I also kind of think it's anti-pattern. Because, I mean, we're supposed to be reconciling state. It says there should be a machine, a VM, so let's create it. So the answer for us would be, if we maintain this behavior, would be to just always ensure that VM names and the host names had some entropy at the end, using like the first 7 characters of a UUID, so that the machine would always map to a VM at any one time. But if that VM gets deleted, a new VM gets created with a new name, like the machine name plus some entropy, and then a new node gets added to the cluster as a control plane node or a worker node, and then the old one is eventually ejected. But I said, maybe that's not what we should be doing, right? Maybe we should just be marking the machine an error. And apparently that is what Kappa is doing. And I said, that's funny, because it's literally what we used to do until a user brought this to my attention. And it made complete sense that we should recreate a VM if it gets deleted. So Andy did create this issue, sort of track this discussion. And if, I think we need to be in line with what the CAPI prevailing wisdom is. But at least for now, before there is a resolution on this issue, what I will likely do is at least open a PR that adds entropy to the names of the VMs that get created. Because right now, at least it is a bug, because if the VM gets recreated, it's going to put the cluster into an invalid state, since it's never going to try to actually rejoin the node with a new provider ID to the cluster. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions on that?
I mean, yes and no. I think the main problem that I think, so the vSphere cloud provider, the way it computes the provider ID today, I mean, I think
it's the BIOS UUID.
The BIOS UUID, and I think what it maybe should be is like the instance UUID instead, because instance UUID is the one.
That's not the issue, though. Well, I mean, that could solve the problem. I see what you're saying, but this goes back to our other discussion about how one is permanent and one's not. I see what you're saying, but what you're suggesting is that we apply an instance UUID of the same value to a new machine, and a new VM. And I think it's just safer to just create a new VM with some entropy in the name. And that way, a new node just gets added to the cluster and the old one will be ejected.
So maybe let's take a step back, right? I mean, essentially, if you think about it, you had a machine that you created, and the way the CAPV is, we take the UUID of that machine object and use that as an entry point, not entry point, I should say, as the instance UUID of the VM that we're going to clone or we're going to create, right? Now, if you think about now how we detect whether that VM is existing anymore or not, I mean, there's a couple of fallback options that happen, right? Whether the VM more exists. If that's not there, can we find it with instance UUID, right? And it's only after all of those have failed is when we decide in the logic to say, okay, we're missing that.
We're already creating the new VM with the same instance UUID, so you're right. It already has that, but yeah, we can investigate that. But I know for a fact that the cloud provider gets its provider ID by looking at the BIOS UUID, because Kubernetes gives it the system ID, which reads that serial ID file out of like process DMI, wherever, whatever, right? So it's getting it from that file, which is the BIOS UUID.
Yes, that is true. But I think what I mean, essentially, this kind of probably goes to maybe as an issue in the vSphere cloud provider.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe because the cloud provider has to be able to look it up uniquely, and the name isn't unique enough. So that's why.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. What I meant is like for example, one of the potential workflow could be from the vSphere cloud provider. If you think would be, well, get the BIOS UUID from the VM as it is doing today, because that is the only available unique identifier that it can use, right? Mm-hmm. But once you have found that, now it can look it up. It can also look up when it actually did find the VM by that UUID. It can actually look at the instance UUID and use that as a provider instead of using the same. I mean, so that.
Yeah, that actually is a much cleaner solution. You're right. But the thing is, CAPV, they both have to switch to that pretty in a pretty in sync manner, or otherwise both of the, like, I think the cloud provider actually would have to change first. And I don't know what its current, I don't know what that would break. So Andrew, do you mind making a note to at least have me or you or Siddharth, somebody open an issue in the cloud provider to investigate what is involved in changing the provider ID set by the cloud provider? Because that would be more conducive to this scenario where we want to recreate a VM. But again, it may be a total wash, because if the decision from CAPI is that it should just be marked an error, which I don't personally agree with, but I want to follow the CAPI guidelines here. I think we should anyway.
True, but I mean, essentially, if you think about CAPI, it's all about, as you earlier said, right? I mean, it's reconciling the state. It's like if you think about, like, if you draw parallels to the Kubernetes side, if you decide, if you created a daemon set, or if you created a deployment.
Hey, you're preaching to the choir.
I know.
So what I'm going to suggest is jump on this issue.
Yes, I will.
CAPI and put your thoughts that, hey, I agree that it should recreate the virtual machine. Like, I agree with you. Absolutely. It may.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll open I'll open an issue on the vSphere cloud provider as well, since I have that context right now.
That'd be great.
And you can probably figure out what possible solutions could be done on their side.
Yeah. So that was. Go ahead.
I just want to add 2 cents. So like in the similar way, the cloud provider just will scan a node if it goes unready, and if it finds that it's deleted in the provider, it deletes the node object as well. That might also be a reasonable option for this, because changing the provider ID is pretty much going to break compatibility rules, and so we might want to take a different approach where we follow the same like node ref or we like match the machine to the node, and if the node's deleted, just delete the machine also, and then just let the machine set kind of do its thing.
How do you mean it'll break compatibility rules?
If you change the provider ID and you do an upgrade, and then the provider expects a different provider ID format, then that would break.
Well, it's not format; it'll be a different value. But yeah, you're right. So it would have to be a clean break to work.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, he's right, Siddharth, that it would have to be a clean break.
I mean, either that, or I mean, within the cloud provider could handle that gracefully as well. Exactly.
Yeah. Which would be annoying.
So I guess if you were to transition, if I were to implement that feature, I would definitely put it in a way that it can support both in terms of backwards compatibility issue, just because of that upgrade scenario that Andrew Sycam mentioned. But because that's a very valid scenario, and I agree that
they are UUIDs, so the collision part potential is very small. That if you checked both, that one would be mistaken for the other.
True.
So there is the ability to check both, but yeah. Anyway, so we're almost out of time. We got through what I put on the backlog. Is there any outstanding issue that wasn't here that anyone wants to address that we can, or any other issues people want to see added to the 041 backlog? And this is mutable, right? This is just what I threw on there from the top. I've been triaging the issues and trying to figure out what makes sense.
I mean, I don't have an issue, but I do have a question actually. So can you go to that the cloud provider spec that you added, like if you can open that. Pretty much like the first file that you had like in your change set, you had like the example. If you can just go to that, right here. So the global secret name and the secret namespace. Now my question is, because I was actually trying to do that, but one of the problems that I saw was if with kubeadm, when you use that, now how do you, like, there's a chicken and egg problem. Your Kubernetes, if you specify your cloud provider configuration in kubeadm configuration, then kubeadm will just bring up that, and you don't get an opportunity to basically create that secret.
Like, we do. We don't have time to get into it now, but after this call, I'll walk you through that. This isn't part of the kubeadm configuration, by the way. This is the cluster. This is part of cluster provider spec.
Yeah, no, I know. But what I'm saying is, because previously, I mean, like before this configuration is extracted out like this, I did want to get the cloud provider configuration move away from the stored passwords. And
that was already in. Cloud providers don't use passwords at all. They haven't since the last release.
Okay. All right, that's okay. Then
I'll review that with you, just so everyone knows what issue that is. It is that's actually one of the first things I did after I think the 030 release. It was cloud provider 21 days ago. So
Oh, perfect.
I think you may have even approved it, Siddharth. No, it's Fabio.
No, I don't.
Did you review it?
I
But yeah,
did not, but
so
I'll take a
basically,
look. Okay.
anyone who wants to stay on, I'll tell you real quick. What it does is the machine, as soon as the cluster message loop, the cluster reconciler can access an API server, it will inject it with the cloud provider secret. And then since now the cloud provider is running, it will align the node ref, and then a machine can note itself as ready. So it is, and you're right, it's chicken and the egg. It looks like two swim lanes and a swimmer going back and forth across the lanes. A machine has to bring up an API server. The cluster loop is constantly checking that, and once it can log in, it injects the secret for the cloud provider. Now the cloud provider can set the provider ID, and the machine can indicate it's ready, and a cluster can say that it's online. But yeah,
Sure.
it worked.
Okay.
Obviously. Otherwise, the test would break. So anyway,
perfect. Thanks for pointing that.
Yeah, Siddharth, I'll Slack at you right after this, and I'll show you how that works. But thanks everyone for the great call, and I look forward to working on 041. And please feel free to file new issues or jump on Slack if you think something should be added to the backlog for that release. And again, it doesn't have a date because we need a few more, at least one more engineer working on this, writing code. So if anyone has time they can volunteer, that would be much appreciated.
Hey, Andrew, before you go, I see Bryson Shepard appeared on the call. Bryson, are you available to talk? There's something I wanted to bring up with you.
Sure.
So I don't know if you're aware of this, but we've been running this VMware SIG for the cloud provider within the Kubernetes project. And they are refactoring these because with a growing number of cloud providers, they just had too many SIGs. So they're folding them underneath the cloud provider SIG that Andrew runs. But in conjunction with that, we're planning to split off user groups for the popular platforms, including vSphere. And I'm putting together a proposal to go to the Kubernetes Steering Committee to charter a user group specifically for Kubernetes users running on top of vSphere. And to get them to buy off on that, they've asked to have a couple charter user members. Now, there's no specific time obligation in this. In other words, you don't have to assume the chair role, meaning that you'd have to be there more or less every meeting, but you would have to put your name down as telling the CNCF that you're interested in seeing a user group like this get formed. Is there any chance you might be willing to put your name on that charter? I'll give you time. You can get back to me if you want to think about it.
I was muted when I was talking and unmuted when I was listening. So how is it different than what we were doing in the past?
Well, I think you'll get less developer discussions of kind of internals and more user-focused things. It's basically going to split the activity we had